Baptism is. Baptism is done for the forgiveness of sins, Acts 2:38. Baptism is done to save us, 1 Peter 3:21, Acts 2:40, Mark 16:16. Baptism is done to wash away our sins, Acts 22:16. Baptism is done to be reborn to new life, John 3:5, Romans 6:3-6. Baptism is done to clothe ourselves with Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27.
Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path.
For the author of Genesis, the origin of Moab lay in the punchline of an off-color joke. I'm speaking, of course, of the story of Lot and his daughters as recorded in Genesis 19. In the aftermath of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and their mother's salty demise, Lot's daughters act on their concern for the future of their family line by seducing their father. The key passage is as follows. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. I do not think we are out of line to see a good deal of significance in this story. It occurs at a key point in world history according to the logic of Genesis. We have moved from Noah through Ham and Japheth to Shem, and there picked up the all-important line of Terah. Here, the main line of the story follows Abraham, and we encounter a series of irregular births. First, Ishmael, father of the Arabs, followed by Moab and Ben-Ami, and culminating in the equally irregular but divinely blessed birth of Isaac. The rather unseemly story of Lot and his daughters is therefore explicitly about origins, which in the genealogical imagination of Genesis helps to explain present substances. Surely the author of Genesis would say amen to the Old English proverb, "What's bred in the bone will not out of the flesh." The significance of this story of Moabite and Ammonite origins goes even deeper than can be appreciated from our English translation. Note that Moab, particularly in its gentilic form, Moabi, that is Moabite, that's how you would say Moabite in Hebrew, can be somewhat willfully parsed as meh, from, ab, father, my. In other words, from my father. Similarly, the eponymous ancestor of the Bene Ammon, that's sons of Ammon or Ammonites, is here rendered as Ben-Ami, son of my close patrilineal kinsman. So clearly the author of Genesis doesn't want us to miss the point that drives this story, the punchline that I referred to a few minutes ago. Moabites and Ammonites in their very names, that could be read as from my father or from my own father, and from my close, all too close relative. So their very names bear the marks of what the heading in my NRSV Bible calls their shameful origins. As their names attest, they are children of incest, and so it is natural that despite common ancestry, we Israelites should separate ourselves from them and fight against them today. This rather clever bit of wordplay raises a number of issues that I would like to talk about today regarding biblical archaeology as it applies to the study of Iron Age Moab. I should preface my talk by saying that I am neither a biblical archaeologist, well, I should say I'm not a biblical scholar, and I am barely a biblical archaeologist. I say this because while I am an archaeologist working in what is ostensibly the Holy Land and the biblical period, that is, I work in Jordan in the Iron Age, I rarely do what I imagine a biblical archaeologist ought to be doing, namely bringing the Bible and the archaeological record together in a serious, critical, and comparative manner. This is due in part to my own research interests. I'm interested in things like agriculture and beginnings of states and economy and politics. Part of it is because I'm employed in an anthropology department, so frankly I don't teach about the Bible on a regular basis. But To tell you the truth, a good deal of this is good old-fashioned self-preserving fear. Few things in this world are as daunting as the mountains of paper that have accumulated in the world's libraries under the label of biblical studies, and few endeavors are more open to derision, if done poorly, than biblical archaeology. However, unlike what one may read these days, even occasionally, dare I say it, in the pages of Biblical Archaeology Review, I do think one can do biblical archaeology well, that is, in an intellectually responsible manner. However, I also think that everybody would agree that doing biblical archaeology well ain't easy. So, one starting point for what I would think is responsible biblical archaeology is to recognize the fact that the Bible and archaeology share a good deal in common. Both look back on the same location in time and space, that is, both are looking at the past of the southern Levant, of what's now Israel, Jordan, and whatever we want to call the Palestinian area, between a period of about 1200 and 586 BCE. And both archaeology and the Bible seek to construct meaningful and important stories about what they see. In general, the Bible and archaeology differ radically on where they look when they look to the past. The Bible looks to traditions and stories handed on. Archaeologists look at broken potsherds and bits and pieces of old buildings. And also, they have very different definitions about what constitutes a meaningful and important story. The Bible has social and spiritual criteria. Archaeologists tend to have somewhat empirical and academic criteria. But nonetheless, if we think about them as sort of doing the same thing, then it helps us think about what it means to bring them together. For me, the first issue that arises is a familiar one, namely the need to keep archaeology and the Bible separate in the first instance. That is, to both read the Bible and write archaeology as best we can in their own terms. That is, to do our utmost to understand them in and of themselves before we try and bring them together. Now, however, while this is a familiar position, you'll hear archaeologists particularly say this all the time, I think my reasons for holding it are a little bit less familiar. I do not, for instance, presume that one should separate the Bible and archaeology because the Bible is a patchwork of temporally disparate, biased, and occasionally contradictory sources, while archaeology is somehow solid, factual, and objective. Indeed, I think quite the opposite is true. The Bible is powerful and coherent. The final editing and canonization that gave us the corpus of literature we call the Bible has resulted in a narrative that draws you in, building on itself in ways that are aesthetically, intellectually, and spiritually rich. By comparison, archaeology is fragmentary, incoherent, and thin, full of interesting but disparate facts that are limited by the dry forms and narrow imagination that scholarly narratives allow. And having just come from a scholarly academic conference where you sat through numerous presentations, I can say again, amen to the to the limits of how we are able to express things about archaeology. But here lies the problem for biblical archaeology. The Bible will always be the better story. Its rich characters, dramatic plots, and deeply meaningful messages will draw archaeology and archaeologists in its wake. But if this happens, what is achieved? If archaeology merely illuminates what the Bible already says, if it sets its priorities and its focus by those of the Bible, what will we learn? In essence, by not separating the Bible and archaeology in the first instance, we forego not only the opportunity to understand and access an ancient world that is somewhat larger than is presented to us in the Bible, but we also forego the opportunity to learn anything new about the Bible itself. Understanding the Bible and archaeology in their own terms requires us to look closely at each. So let's begin by looking closely at what the Bible says about Moab. If we line up all the biblical passages in which Moab is mentioned, we find that these references divide into 4 types. Most commonly, Moab is a simple geographic designation, and of these, in fact, most of them are references to the plains of Moab in the Exodus narratives, where Yahweh gives Moses his final charge regarding the entry into Canaan, while telling him that he himself will not be allowed to make that entry. Second most common are short expressions of simple antagonism. That is, passages where Moab is mentioned briefly as a source of religious or military conflict. For example, Numbers 25:1 states that people of Israel were cavorting with Moabite women at Shittim, which led the Israelites to bow down to the gods of Moab. Or in 2 Samuel 23:20, Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, is said to be a valiant man because he had killed a lion and 2 lion-like men of Moab. In other words, many short passages in the Bible are predicated on the assumption that Moab and Moabites are people you fight against, and that any other kind of contact with them leads inevitably to apostasy and idolatry. The third category of references to Moab, which are sort of spelled out here in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories, are actually longer stories in which Moab plays an important role. What is striking about all of these is the degree to which unusual, even fantastic events serve to highlight the foolish or unseemly nature of Moabites. We have already mentioned the story of Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19, where one can see the Bible arguing that Moab's scandalous birth foreshadows what is to come. Moab appears secondarily in the story of Sihon, the Amorite, king of Heshbon, who is said to have taken from the Moabs the area known as the Mishor, or tableland lying between Heshbon, that's modern Heshban, and the Arnon, modern Wadi Mujib, in central Jordan. While told principally in Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy 2, it is clear from subsequent references such as Judges 11 that the story of Sihon was seen as justifying an Israelite claim to this territory. For our purposes, it is the extended companion story of Balaam, the prophet, in Numbers 22-24 that is of particular interest. I don't know how many of you know some of these stories offhand. I'm going to sort of recount them partially because they're really good and kind of interesting, and I will presume, although I'm sure many, if not most of you, are familiar with these. So what happens in this story is the Israelites have gone around Moab, have passing through the northern part of the Mishor, have just defeated Sihon, and Balak, king of Moab, looks down on them. He sees their numbers, their success, and he becomes very, very worried. So what he does is he sends long distance for a very, very famous prophet, Balaam, son of Beor, and asks him to come on contract to curse the Israelites. What's interesting about this as a side note is that, in fact, there is now an archaeological evidence to show that there is a tradition of Balaam, of a prophet named Balaam of some sort associated with Transjordan, a site called Deir Allah in the Jordan Valley. Excavations there found a wall, a plaster wall, on which a rather odd and difficult to understand prophecy is written out and attributed to a prophet named Balaam. That actually dating probably to the 8th century BCE. So what happens? He sends the message to Balaam, and Yahweh intervenes. He comes to Balaam in a vision, tells him that he can go, but only if he conveys the words that Yahweh himself will give to him. So to emphasize this point, on his way, while riding his donkey to Moab, a messenger of Yahweh blocks the path. The donkey can see this messenger, but Balaam can't. The donkey cringes or balks in fear. Balaam becomes very upset. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced a donkey driver in the Middle East. There's a lot of reality in this story. Balaam begins to beat the donkey, and the donkey then speaks to Balaam, protesting this mistreatment given his many years of loyal service. And then at this moment, Balaam then sees the messenger of Yahweh and goes on to Balak, where he totally horrifies his Moabite employer, because every time he comes up to curse the Israelites, he actually ends up blessing them. So Balak is paying this guy. They go up to a spot, they make a sacrifice, he looks down, he sees the Israelites and he blesses them. And the Moabite king says, well, wait a minute, maybe you didn't see them very well from here. Let's go to this other hill. And this happens a number of times. And each time it happens, of course, the king of Moab is becoming more and more desperate and upset by the circumstances. The next story that we encounter is the story of Ehud the Israelite and Eglon the fat king of Moab in Judges 3. Here, the clever left-handed Ehud smuggles a short sword into Eglon's palace. The Moabites are said to be oppressing Israel at this time, so the sort of crafty left-handed Israelite comes into the palace. He manages to trick Eglon into having a private conference with him, and sure enough, Eglon stabs him with a left-handed blow, and it says in the text that that Eglon's fat closes around the shaft of the sword. So he stabs him all the way in, and Eglon is so fat that you can't even see the sword at the end. On top of which, Ehud escapes because Eglon's attendants are reluctant or shy about entering his private chambers, thinking that he is, to be put it delicately, answering nature's call. So what I want to emphasize is that despite these ribald, even farcical elements, the Bible is not so simplistic as to do nothing but ridicule Moabites. Ruth, in many ways, is the archetypal good daughter in the Bible, and she is also a Moabitess. And this fact is not coincidental, it's central to the story. In my opinion, the story of Ruth is about the moral obligations of Levirate marriage, namely the obligation of a childless widow to provide legitimate offspring for her deceased husband's family. Here, Ruth, a Moabitess, provides a stellar example for Israelite women, for she does not abandon Naomi, her mother-in-law, despite the many very legitimate reasons why she could have done so. If you remember, not only is it a difference between Ruth being a Moabitess and Naomi being an Israelite, but also Naomi says explicitly she has no more sons who could possibly serve as husbands for Ruth. And on top of which, Naomi herself is a widow and therefore can hardly serve as a protector for Ruth in her new, highly vulnerable social status. The natural thing to do would be for Ruth to return to her father's house, where she would be protected and potentially perhaps remarried to someone else. But instead, she follows her obligations and sticks with Naomi, and she is rewarded. She marries Naomi's kinsman, Boaz, and we learn that her offspring become fully Israelite, culminating ultimately with the birth of King David himself. So the importance of Ruth's Moabite status in all of this cannot be overemphasized. I want to remind you that Deuteronomy 23:3 states that no Moabite will enter the congregation of Yahweh even to the 10th generation. That Numbers 25:1 states that Israel fell into apostasy by, I use the King James here because it's very colorful, by committing whoredom with the daughters of Moab. That 1 Kings 11:1 lists Moabites among the foreign women that caused Solomon's spiritual downfall, and that both Ezra and Nehemiah pressured Judeans to put away their Moabite wives in order to purify the congregation of Jewish returnees from Babylon. Ruth is singled out as a praiseworthy exemplar, but the power of her example lies in the fact that it is so unexpected from a Moabite. Indeed, I think the story would have considerably less drama and surprise if she was simply an Israelite woman doing what she was supposed to do. So the message is clear. If Ruth, a Moabitess, can do the right thing, so can you, a proper daughter of Israel. Throughout the Bible, the portrayal of Moab is consistently one of conflict, ridicule, and negative expectation. These sentiments perhaps reach their peak in our fourth type of reference to Moab in the Bible, the so-called oracles against the nations in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos. For the most part, these prophecies of doom for Judah's neighbors simply glory in the coming destruction and humiliation of Moab. Jeremiah 48, for example, states, the horn of Moab is cut off, and his arm is broken, says the Lord. He is made as if drunken, for he magnified himself against the Lord. Moab will wallow in his own vomit, and he will be an object of derision. Yet again, I'm sorry because the lights just came on. I'll try and, I have less gap between my slides from now on in, so maybe we can keep the lights down. Yet again, the Bible is never so simple as to simply gloat over the destruction of Moab. Instead, expectations are overturned in several places, such as Amos 2:4, where Judah is subject to the same condemnation that the immediately preceding verse sent against Moab. So what we have is we have a typical oracle against the nation, just like the readers would expect. The prophet comes out and foretells the doom of one of Israel's immediate neighbors, their close enemies. But then, in the very next verse, he does the same thing to Judah. And that sort of inversion of your expectations is what gives a real punch to the prophecy. So, this equation of Moab and Judah strikes at the heart of the tension that relates to Moab in the Bible. Moab is not only an enemy to be fought, humiliated, and excluded, Moab is also a lot like home. Consider some of the parallels in how the Pentateuch portrays the origins of Moab and Israel. Both are said to occupy the same genealogical position as great-grandsons. I think I wrote grandson, but it's actually great-grandsons of Terah, because their fathers, Lot and Isaac, are first cousins. And you have to remember that in the Bible, genealogy is really, really important. Who you're related to tells a lot about your obligations. It tells a lot about who you're like. So when stories make a point of emphasizing groups being related to each other fairly directly, they're also making a statement that these are people who in some way are very similar to each other. So also, both Moab and Israel are said to have been granted inheritances of land by Yahweh. Indeed, in claiming this inheritance, both are said to have displaced indigenous groups of people. They're known as Rephaim. Sometimes in the older translations, they'll be translated as giants. You think that when Joshua and Caleb go to visit the Promised Land, they come back with a report of its richness, and the others report the giants living in the land. Well, so there are two such groups. The Anakim are said to be displaced by the Israelites, and the Moabites displace a group called the Emim. Finally, both are described as the people of a particular god, Yahweh in the case of Israel and Chemosh in the case of Moab. These equations should not be surprising, since we know from archaeological evidence that Moabites and Israelites probably spoke mutually intelligible languages, in fact probably dialects of each other's language. They shared a common lifestyle and even had many common religious practices. One example, I don't go into it in this paper, but for example, if anybody knows about what's called the ban in King James Version of the Bible, where things captured from a city are burned, and sometimes the people captured are also killed rather than taken as booty. This is an institution. The same word, herem, occurs in the Bible, and it occurs in a Moabite inscription. Okay. So for the Bible, the problem is understanding this commonality between Israel and Moab in such a way that you still define Israelites and Judeans as unified and distinct. So on one hand, you have to recognize that Israel and Moab are somewhat like each other, but on the other hand, you need to be emphasizing how you're different, and you need to make sure that people recognize and profess this difference. So, for example, Moabites are kinsmen, but they are marred by incest. Moabites may attempt to dominate you, but they can be made foolish by crafty Israelites and by Yahweh. A Moabite can even serve as a good example, such as in the case of Ruth, but they must do this by doing the unexpected and following Israelite traditions against their own apparent self-interest. For Israelites and Judeans, Moab is the familiar other, the enemy whose very closeness requires systematic denigration, and yet whose systematic denigration makes possible powerful inversions of expectations in certain key passages like the book of Ruth and the prophecies of Amos. So in order to have these kinds of very meaningful, strong inversions, making people question their expectations, you first have to have the expectations. So Ruth is only meaningful if people expect her to be a bad Moabitess and not to be a good, good daughter of Israel. Okay. So, finding common characterizations of Moab in biblical stories does not necessitate any claims as to whether the events recounted did or did not actually happen. In certain cases, such as that of Balaam's talking donkey, a literalist reading does require an adherence to the Bible's own explanation of divine intervention. But if one accepts this as a first principle, then literalists and people who read it symbolically can only agree to disagree. Whatever the case, whether literary creations or verbatim accounts, these stories were consciously selected from amongst many others for canonization, and this selection has given us a body of literature with a particular view of ancient Moab. The point I would like to make is that these stories are interested in the sense that they construct, fulfill, and play with their audience's expectations regarding Moab and Moabites. Think for the moment about one simple fact. For every Israelite story glorifying the cleverness of Ehud, one could imagine a Moabite version emphasizing his cowardly treachery, using subterfuge to stab a man in secret with a highly unnatural left-handed stroke. The juxtaposition of these two stories would potentially reveal not only new facts, but also different orientations to those facts, different assumptions about the way the world should be read. Strangely enough, we do have two such parallel accounts relating to the so-called revolt of Mesha, king of Moab, recounted in 2 Kings chapter 3. In the biblical account, Mesha is a sheep-herding vassal of the northern kingdom of Israel who rebels after the death of Ahab. Jehoram, the second king of Israel after Ahab, sets up a coalition with the kings of Judah and Edom, and they set off to attack Moab from the south. Elisha the prophet is brought along for good measure, and with some reluctance, he prophesies a devastating victory over Moab. This almost occurs as the Moabites, in typical fashion, are confused by an early morning reflection on the water and rush at the coalition's camp, thinking that fighting has broken out between Israelites, Judeans, and Edomites. The Moabites are routed, and after a devastating burnt earth campaign, the coalition arrives at the walls of Kir Hareseth, Moab's capital. While the Moabite king, trapped inside, ends up committing the shocking act of sacrificing his firstborn son on the walls of the city, spreading panic through the Israelite ranks and leading to a massive retreat. Here we see some of the elements already pointed out for the Bible's depiction of Moabites. They once again are deceived through an act of Yahweh, and they engage in shockingly unseemly behavior. This time, however, we can juxtapose a Moabite account of the same general events, if not the same exact battles. In 1868, Friedrich Klein, an Anglican missionary, was shown an inscribed basalt stela at the site of Dibon. Dibon is located right here in the central part of modern Jordan, the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, Amman, the capital of Jordan, located here. So he was shown this stone by the Beni Hamida tribe. In fact, the subsequent battle to acquire this is really quite a fascinating story. At this point in time, the initial sort of finds by Layard and Bota in Mesopotamia had hit the public. And the translation of Akkadian cuneiform had made the biblical world all the rage in Europe, and there was a huge competition on to acquire particularly texts from the Near East, particularly texts that would relate to the Bible. And the Mesha inscription seemed to indicate that there was the potential for rich hoards of documents in the biblical lands themselves, in the Holy Land itself, comparable to what one was finding in what's now Iraq. Subsequent excavation has shown that we just kind of got lucky at the beginning, and that there aren't the same volume of texts. But this there was a huge atmosphere of competition between Prussians, particularly if you've been to Berlin, the Vorderadische Museum is built on these kinds of people, in the Prussians out in the Middle East acquiring this material. Also the French, the Louvre, was heavily involved, and of course the British Museum as well. Americans, my own museum, in fact, was founded in this same uproar, and we were the first American expedition. We went to Iraq in 1889, and we were so confident that we were going to find lots of stuff that the museum was actually built before the expedition was started, so that we could house it all. And sure enough, we found 60,000 cuneiform tablets. So fortunately, they weren't wrong. But this kind of atmosphere was what the mid to late 19th century was all about. And the story, the race to acquire the Mesha inscription is one of both high intrigue and low dealings. One thing that happened is the French sent out a representative to take a paper squeeze of the inscription, and he got into a fight with the Beni Hammida, and he was forced to tear the squeeze off in a hurry before it was dry and jump on his horse. Even doing that, he was stabbed in the leg with a spear by the Beni Hammida, and he raced away with this wet paper squeeze all rolled up, which meant that it was only partially successful. Then the Beni Hammida themselves, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, heated the stone up and dipped it in water so that it broke into pieces. A lot of people have said it's because they figured there had to be gold inside, since why else would all these Europeans want it? But another, probably more reasonable explanation is that one of their worst enemies in the Ottoman government, the Pasha of Nablus, was sent by the Ottoman authorities to negotiate, to intervene between the European consuls in Jerusalem and the Beni Hammida. And they had just the previous summer had a feud with this very person, the Pasha of Nablus, who tried to collect taxes from them. So probably they may have done it just to spite him. Whatever the case, the Mesha inscription was broken up into numerous pieces. But a French scholar, Clermont-Ganneau, gathered together all the pieces he could, which are these over here. He then took the squeeze that had been made earlier and used it to complete the missing portions. And this then is the reconstruction you still see today on display in the Louvre. And what it is a 34-line inscription, heavily broken at the bottom and incomplete, but fairly complete for the first 3 quarters. And it's written in a form of what you might call Phoenician or Paleo-Hebrew script. It is, for those, I'm sure many of you are aware, the script of the Iron Age is actually not the square Hebrew script that we see today. That was a development that came in the 5th century BC under the influence of Aramaic. So this is the inscription, and it tells the story of Mesha's revolt against Israelite control of northern Moab, the biblical Mishor. In brief, Mesha recounts how, on one hand, he waged a series of successful military campaigns against cities in northern Moab controlled by the king of Israel, and on the other hand, he sponsored a massive building campaign in his capital and across Moab. A good deal of ink has been spilled over how one can or cannot correlate specific details in the Bible with those of the Mesha inscription. For example, the Mesha inscription states Israel controlled Madaba during the reign of Omri and half the reign of his son for a total of 40 years. If one takes the end of this period to be the moment of Mesha's revolt, then it occurs halfway through Ahab's reign, rather than after his death, as claimed in the Bible. On the other hand, the total length of Omri and half of Ahab's reign is only 23 years, according to the Bible, rather than the 40 years stated in the Mesha inscription, which seems very much like a round number. 40 is one of those magic numbers in the ancient world that seems to represent one generation's lifetime. Various solutions to these problems have been offered, but frankly, I find most of these discussions pointlessly scholastic, as they demand a level of exactness that neither document can ever provide. Instead, it's interesting to see how the same set of events is understood differently by the Bible and the Mesha inscription. It is, in its ordering of events, the Bible suggests that Moab was originally subdued by David, along with a number of other nations neighboring Israel, as a result of Yahweh's blessing of David and his house through Nathan in 2 Samuel 7. While the text of 2 Kings 3 has only a limited intervention by Yahweh in the whole episode of Mesha's revolt, the comments of the narrator and the prophet Elisha seem to suggest that the revolt could be credited, at least in part, to the unacceptable religious practices of Jehoram and the house of Omri, including, of course, most famously Ahab and Jezebel. The Mesha inscription, on the other hand, dates the oppression of Moab to the reign of Omri and credits it to the god Chemosh's displeasure with his land. No mention is made of Mesha as a vassal of Israel, and indeed one is led to believe that both Mesha and his father somehow held the fort against Israel, at least insofar as the territory of Dibon was concerned. Mesha's campaigns against Israel are portrayed as coming at the spoken command of Chemosh in a manner not unlike one finds in the Bible with reference to the commands of Yahweh. All of Mesha's campaigns in the Mesha inscription are portrayed as offensive and decisive. Hence, even though there is room in the damaged lower portion of the inscription, down in here, for further campaigns in the south, the story in 2 Kings 3 of a siege of the capital and a miraculous deliverance is completely out of place with the overall victorious tone of this inscription. It's not surprising. This is a royal inscription. The king put it up for the purpose of glorifying his reign. And so he never loses, he never gets into any trouble in all of the events. So that's not, that difference is not surprising. So all of this is simply to highlight that what we can safely assume to be a set of events that actually happened at a specific time and a specific place has generated two documents that reflect the different objectives and conventions of their respective authors. I think recent events in Florida might underline how this can happen. Anyway, one of the conventions on the biblical side is to emphasize a cat and dog-like antagonism between Israel and Moab, drawn against a background of explicitly recognized similarity. We may recognize that in selecting such stories about Moab, biblical authors were playing an important role in constituting and reaffirming Israelite or Judean self-identity at certain key points in their history, reminding them that they are a unique political, religious, and even ethnic community. While such goals are understandable and even illuminating, we must ask if they are really cause us any problems when we turn to look at the archaeology of Iron Age Moab in its own terms. In other words, what does it mean if we are aware that the Bible has a particular role for Moab? Can that role help or get in the way or guide us or conflict with what we want to do when we're looking at the archaeology of Moab in the Iron Age? So first off, despite what my anthropological colleagues have been saying as of late, archaeology must be written, it can't be read. You see lots of stuff about archaeology as like a text. You read it, interpret it. And as I implied earlier, this writing is made difficult by the fragmentary, incoherent nature of archaeological evidence. Certainly, the powerful, coherent narratives of the Bible provide one storyline that we could use to get our ducks in a row, as my old graduate advisor used to say when you were writing a paper. First, you got to get your ducks in a row. So, yet I think, as I've communicated today, the biblical stories about Moab were never written with this purpose in mind. Although I dare say their Judean authors might be pleased to think that it was their version of Moab that was being preserved. While with the time remaining, I would like to take a close look at some archaeological finds from Moab during the early Iron Age and consider what is gained or lost, what is found or missed by using the Bible as our principal means of interpreting these finds. The title of this talk foreshadows my conclusions, as there are many things we do not know about Moab if viewed strictly through a biblical lens, and indeed there are many things we will never know if this is our only perspective. So, if we could focus that a little bit, I'm going to begin with an enigmatic find that was discovered in 1930 at the site of Belua, located here at a tributary of the Arnon or Wadi Mujib. And this stela is a large basalt slab that is composed of two parts. There is an upper register with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of text, and a lower register with a scene. Since the Blue Stela was found by accident and then turned over to the antiquities authorities, we don't know very much about its context, and so any information we get from it we have to take from the interpretation of the inscription or of the scene. And unfortunately, the inscription is something of a Rorschach blot, you know, those ink blot pictures. It reveals more about a scholar's own interest and expertise than about the inscription itself. It's very, very eroded, and it appears, based on photographs, to have eroded considerably more between 1930 and this past summer, for example, when I and actually my wife as well looked at it in Amman. Now, the suggestions for what this inscription is have ranged from Cipro-Minoan, Linear B, Biblite, the undeciphered late Bronze Age script from Deir Allah, standard Egyptian hieratic, and graffito Egyptian hieratic. My wife, Carolyn Routledge, herself an Egyptologist, has managed to convince me that the script contains at least one and perhaps two good Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. I will let you be the judge. Note these striding figures here and these squatting figures here. And if you squint, there is potentially a striding figure here and a squatting figure here. I can't say any more than that. You may think that I shouldn't even say that much. But whatever the case, the result is the same. It's an untranslatable inscription. The scene, however, is a bit more informative. While very poorly executed, the scene is a standard Egyptian investiture scene with what is probably a god on the left-hand side. That's over here. Handing symbols of power to a central figure, probably a king, who is being presented to the deity by a goddess on the right. This scene is very standard, as I said, in Egyptian. This is actually the Merneptah, or Israel stela, and at the top you see here a god, an investiture scene with a god presenting to the king, and another deity on this side, a god, and this side a goddess, presenting the deity to the other deity. The central figure has an odd headdress as well as a very odd beard and facial features. He's not depicted as an Egyptian. He is, in fact, depicted as a Canaanite Bedouin, a nomad, known in Egyptian sources as a shashu. And here's a shashu here with one of these headdresses and pointy beards. So, for a number of reasons that I will not take the time to review, the scene and styles of dress favor dating this stela to some point in the reign of Ramses, between the reign of Ramses II. Here's Ramses II, as we know him today, and Ramses III. That is between about 1279 and 1153 BCE. Or, for those of you who know your archaeological terminology, between Late Bronze Age 2B and Iron 1A. As in most matters, if you want to know more about this, I'll actually send you to my wife, Carolyn. She gave a paper on the Belua Stela yesterday at the American Schools of Oriental Research meetings here in Nashville. So, the existence of a poorly executed but highly authentic Egyptian scene featuring a probable Shashu ruler receiving divine authority at the time period generally associated with the Exodus narratives has, of course, drawn a certain amount of attention. Udo Vorschek, a recent excavator of Belua, notes that at the Luxor Temple in Egypt, Ramses II mentions conducting military campaigns in the land of Moab during his reign, and that the people in the cities he is depicted as fighting are portrayed differently than are the Shashu. He suggests that these city dwellers are the biblical Emim, the people displaced according to the Bible by the Moabites. And so therefore he sees the Belua Stela as a scene of the founder of Moab leaving his nomadic Shashu life to set himself up as king after defeating the sedentary Emim with the help of Egyptian military intervention. Clearly, in Dvorak's reconstruction, we see the biblical narrative looming large in the effort to find a historical context for this object. Yet, on what grounds can we bring together the three elements that Dvorak uses, Egyptian records, the stela, and the Bible? The stela and the Egyptian records are potentially linked by common place in Egyptian culture and by chronology, although Dvorak is really overstating the amount of information you can extract from Egyptian wall reliefs. They're not as specific as he pretends. The Bible, interestingly enough, says nothing about an Egyptian presence in Canaan at the time of the Exodus, despite significant archaeological and textual evidence, including even the mention of a group called Israel in the reign of Merneptah. Hence, from a biblical perspective, there's no means by which one can link the story of the expulsion of the Emim with physical evidence for an Egyptian presence or textual evidence for Egyptian campaigns. Furthermore, as we've already noted, the explicit parallelism drawn by the Bible between Moabites displacing Emim and Israelites displacing Anakim is, in the first instance, there to account for the similarity of Moab and Israel, rather than to present that fact in and of itself. So as you may have already guessed, as you may have already guessed, I see that this is really a stylistic feature of the story. Also, the theme of external origin and the displacement of pre-existing peoples in claiming territorial inheritance is important, seems to be important to the way that Israel understood its own history, but also the history of all of the surrounding peoples. Almost everybody who borders on Israel is given a story of having displaced some original person: Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, and even the Philistines. Now, archaeologically, we have evidence that the Philistines did probably come from outside the area, that they even came from the Aegean, which fits roughly with the biblical suggestion that they're from Kaftor, that is Crete. But in that case, we can reach that conclusion from the archaeological evidence itself. And then we can juxtapose the biblical story and the archaeological evidence. In the case of Moab, we have no way archaeologically of reaching the conclusion that there was a group, the Emim, displaced by a later group, the Moabites. We can only reach that interpretation, we can only interpret the Blue Stela this way by first assuming that this is the case. And this is the problem when we bring the Bible and archaeology together before we fully developed either one. Okay, now I'm going to move on to show another example from my own excavations of how this kind of prefiguring of archaeological remains by going first to biblical narratives creates interpretive problems, particularly as we acquire more archaeological evidence. So I work at the site of Kibbutz al-Mudena al-Aliyah, located in south-central Jordan. It's a site that is extremely isolated on the very outer limits of settlement in the Moabite Plateau. The famous biblical scholar and archaeologist Nelson Glick, who was later president of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, did some pioneering survey work in Transjordan in the 1930s, and he visited a number of sites, including my site, which I'll refer to as KMA, so I don't have to say Kibbutz al-Mudena al-Aliyah over and over and over again. And he noted that there are, in fact, a large number of fortified settlements located on the outer limits, on the outer edges of the Jordanian highlands. He suggested that these were fortresses set up by the early Moabite state, and this is explained by references in the Exodus narrative where it said that Moab went around, Israel went around Moab because they were too strong and because their king didn't let them pass through. Now, subsequent research, particularly Max Miller's Central Moab Survey. Max Miller was for a long time at Emory University. He's now Fernbank Museum in Atlanta. Max looked at a lot of these sites. Quite a number of them turned out not to date to the Iron I period, and so a lot of questions were raised about the existence of a string of fortresses. However, sites such as KMA that did date to the Iron I period were still interpreted primarily as fortresses, partially because they're isolated, well fortified, but still in the background is the assumption that there was some kind of well-established, well-organized defensive system in existence when Israel passed through the land or around the land of Moab. Now, what we discovered first is, yes, indeed, this is a very strikingly fortified site. It's located on a promontory that juts out into a deep wadi with drops of upwards of 800 feet on 3 sides. It can only be approached from the western side, and at that point, there is a dry moat that's been cut to cut off the city, and there's a very large tower that has been built on this far end. We also have a wall system stretching all the way around and fortifying the settlement. This is here. This gives you an idea of what the site looks like. It's a huge mound of massive mound of stones, and here is the remains of a probable gateway. You can pick out the large stones set up here. And this is what the site looks like in plan view. Those of you who follow our Iron Age archaeology will know this as a casemate wall. That's a double wall system with rooms in the middle. Now, the interesting thing, though, is although this is a massively fortified site, 2 things jumped out at us. First, we found that after looking at the pottery carefully, it probably doesn't date to the early Iron I period. It dates to the late Iron I period. It dates to the 11th century, not to the 12th or even the 13th century like Glick proposed. Secondly, when we get in the site, and I'll show you here, we don't find specialized buildings like barracks or magazines that we might expect if it was a fortress. We find a whole series of simple domestic houses ringing around the site. In fact, as we start digging down, which mostly means moving rocks through the giant, all of these buildings, a lot of these houses are actually above ground, preserved above ground, and the roofs have just collapsed and fallen in. And so we spend a lot of our time just moving rocks out of them, which is makes me thankful I'm the boss now and that I don't actually have to lift so many rocks. So once, if you want to, there's a joke, somebody once asked, is archaeology a hard science? And somebody responds, well, it starts out hard, but then when you get graduate students, you can pass on all the back-breaking work to them. So what we find is we find a lot of domestic houses with a huge amount of emphasis just on basic storage. We found 2 massive burned grain piles in different houses. You can see some of them here. And we found, from studying the plant remains, the grain that we found, we've been able to reconstruct some of the farming techniques, and it's quite clear that what they were doing is they were living up on this plateau, this fortified, difficult to get at settlement, and they were down in the wadi bottom using the flood water from the wadi to farm with. So we find wheat and figs and grapes, things that can't grow in the current low rainfall of the area. And we find things like reeds mixed in with the barley, indicating that they were it was grown in a wet environment. And here's just a look at the contrast between the bleak plateau and the relatively verdant wadi bottom. So all of this points to just internally a simple village of agriculturalists, self-sufficient, storing their own grain, relying on their own resources, but they happen to have really significant fortifications protecting them. Not only do we have this one site, my site here, Khirbet al-Muldena al-Aliya, so we also have a series of other sites that are contemporary, all clustered around this part of the Arnon or Wadi Mujib. These sites all date to the Iron I period, but they don't form a ring around Moab. In fact, what they do is they concentrate around this area, which has water, it provides defense, and also it's the main travel route. We know that the biblical route across this massive wadi, which is about more than 2,000 feet deep and almost half a mile across, we know that the crossing was at Aroer right here from biblical references and from the Mesh inscription. So they're all clustered in this area, but unlike the idea of a centralized, well-organized state, in fact, we just see a repetition of this same thing. Fair-sized villages, well-fortified, but entirely seemingly self-reliant and relatively independent. And this kind of fits something. Here's an example of some of these other sites. Another Khirbet al-Muldena, this one Maraja. You can see here a similar kind of plan. This is the site of Lahun. Again, casemate walls. And you can see here casemate enclosing domestic houses all around. So the Mesha inscription, which dates from about 150 years after this, indicates, gives us a picture of what Moab kind of looked like at the time that Mesha came to the throne. That is, at the time when it was under Israelite rule. And there we find actually not a unified, centralized state, but a whole series of little territories that Mesha seems to have to gather together, and in some cases even conquer, in order to make Moab a reality. If you look at the inscription, you'll see there's places called the land of Atarot, land of Madaba. It seems that each major city had a little territory around it. And Mesha actually brings all these together from his base in Diban. And so what we see here is Glick's initial direct use or interpretation, reading the Bible in one way, and then using that narrative to interpret his survey remains, left us for a long time with a rather false idea about what these sites were, at least in my opinion. And so it's only been very recently, in the 1990s really, that we've began to see that there is something different going on. And something similar can be said, and this will be done very quickly, about the organization of the site itself and of the houses. If people have followed the archaeology of Israel, you'll know that there is a kind of thing called a four-room house. It looks like this, a house with 2 rows of pillars and a perpendicular back room. That is the standard house in ancient Israel from about 1200 all the way through to the exile. Now, for the very long time, this was so strongly associated with the areas where the Bible tells us Israelite settlement first occurred. That is the territory between Samaria and Beersheba, that it was thought to be an undeniable indicator of Israelites. That is, if you found a four-room house, there were Israelites at the site, since after all, we find these houses in the area where Israel settled, and they are characteristic of sites we would call Israelite. What we've begun to find in Jordan, all across the plateau, and typified by KMA, Khirbet al-Muldena, is that in fact this house form is rather widespread in similar kind of environmental areas. That is, in places where people would have been living the same kind of lifestyle, relying heavily on sheep and goats as well as agriculture, being in difficult physical settings, and living sort of a simple, fairly self-sufficient life. And so we have quite a number of these houses at Khirbet al-Muldena. Here we see the pillars that I pointed out. Here's another example of pillars with the lintels in place in one of our excavation areas. And we actually have a wide range of forms. We have pillars on 3 sides in one very big house. We have a number of houses where the pillars actually form an L. But most common, we do also have quite a large number of standard, typical four-room houses with the 2 rows of pillars and the back room. Here is some classic examples from Israel, from Beersheba, from Izbet Sarta. And here is one, Yigal Shalot's picture of an ideal Israelite town. You see the four-room or pillared houses up against the casemate wall that encircles the whole town. Now, this is Khirbet al-Mudena, and this is a series of these early Israelite settlements as identified in the archaeological literature from the Beersheba Valley and from the area, particularly between Jerusalem and Samaria. And some are a bit earlier, but a lot of them are contemporary with Khirbet al-Mudena. And we see, although Khirbet al-Mudena is a lot bigger, we see a similar form. We see the ring structure with casemates and the houses up against the walls. I stuck this one in the center of my courtyard. So there's a courtyard in this site, just like at the sites in Israel. So in this case, what has happened is not the rush to interpret Moabite material, but a rush to find markers, ethnic markers for early Israel by looking first and only in the area where the Bible has Israel emerging. And what has happened is through time, as we've begun to move out of that area, we've begun to find that some things that we thought were typical of this one area, and we thought they were typical because we basically only looked in that area, we find that they're fairly widespread and they're shared across people who would have considered themselves Moabites or Israelites. And it again highlights the problem of rushing to the biblical narrative before or in place of rigorously working through the archaeological evidence.
The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world."
Baptism. Then what? Baptism is a burial in water for accountable beings into the remission of sins, for salvation, to get into Christ, to become a new creature, to get into the one body. Then, walk in the new life, study and grow, become a servant of righteousness, keep self pure, be an example, have faith in God, follow Jesus, put first things first, resist temptation, be faithful, and be fruitful.